2 or 3, something Skyble.
Yeah, how incredible. Oh, maybe you should say that.
I have a different story about Washington, D.C.
Are we ready? Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Malcolm Chalmers. I'm the acting director of PONI until the end of today, and then I'm going to pass on that not very onerous task to Tom Plant, who's, I'm delighted, is joining us here at RUSI today. Tom, are you here? Tom is right at the back here, so Tom is going to be taking over as director of PONI after this conference, but and indeed joining RUSI to head up our nuclear program. We're absolutely delighted he is doing so. Before I get formally started, let me just explain in relation to fire alarms. As some of you may recall, there have been fire alarms at both the last 2 PONI conferences. So I don't know whether there are any probability theorists here, but in any case, it's not impossible that there may be one this year. It's that time of year, apparently. So if you're in this hall, the best exit is right behind me on my right. There will be a door there, which staff will open. And if you're upstairs, you can come out this way, but it's probably better to go out at the front and then turn left, and there is a muster point just along the road. So hopefully that will not happen, but you never know. It's also the case, I think, that this is the 3rd year in a row in which the PONI conference has coincided with PERDA. It's something about PONI conferences makes government call elections or indeed referenda. I can't imagine it will be more than 3 in a row, but who knows with British politics. In any case, I think an occasion for this conference is more important than ever. The number of issues, complex challenges which can't be reduced to sound bites, but need careful analysis and consideration, both on the civil and military side of our nuclear agenda, and never more challenging today. But I think it's encouraging to me that there are so many talented young practitioners ready and indeed eager to take up many of those challenges. This is not an agenda which is fixed and will not change over the next 5 to 10 years. It's changing, if anything, more rapidly than ever before, and that's why PONI is so important as providing a contribution to learning, to reasoned debate. On the panels today, you're going to see a variety of different views on many issues, because most of those issues are not fixed. They're ones to be grasped, and for you, the people here, to grasp them. It's also, I'm delighted to say that we are represented today, but I think about 140 people. We're pretty full, as you can see. We had to turn away quite a number of people, so if any of your colleagues applied rather too late, apologies to them by proxy. And we had a record number of people applying to give papers. So again, not everybody who wished to give a paper here was able to do so, but we do have a PONI blog, which is an opportunity for people to use in that regard. And not least, the size of the PONI network now on its 7th conference continues to grow. We now have well over 1,000 members of PONI UK, which we're absolutely delighted about. I'd like to thank all our sponsors for PONI, without whom it would not be possible to hold this or the many other events that PONI holds through the year, and I'd especially like to thank our gold sponsors, the Ministry of Defence, AWE and Lockheed. And last but not least, I would like to give a very heartfelt vote of thanks to the staff who've made this event and indeed PONI's operations possible this year. In particular, and Christina and Jeremy most of all. Christina, are you here? Stand up. Thank you. And Jeremy also at the back by the door. Very helpful indeed. So, without further ado, last point before I turn over to our keynote speaker, is that today all the prepared remarks by speakers will be on the record. They will be filmed by Jack at the back. Thank you, Jack. And they will, you will be able to tweet or otherwise spread whatever they're saying to your heart's content. The hashtag for this conference is hashtag UK PONI 2017, and UK PONI's Twitter address is at UK PONI. But once the speaker has finished and we turn to Q&A, then that will be off the record. I think as much actually to protect the individuals and their affiliation in asking questions, rather than we're going to be dealing with highly classified matters, which we certainly are not. So please bear in mind, do not tweet anything from the Q&A. So it's my great pleasure to ask Sir Adam Thomson to give our first keynote address. I've known Adam for many years from the Foreign Office in particular, and he retired. It still feels quite recently. How long ago is it now, Adam, from NATO? 6 months. That's still quite recent, I think. Retired 6 months ago as the UK's ambassador to NATO after a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Office, dealing with a range of the issues, including the regional issues that we are going to be addressing today. And since then, he has become the director of the European Leadership Network, which of course much of its work focuses on many of the nuclear challenges we're talking about today, particularly in relation to Europe. So experience both inside and outside government in leading roles very relevant to the nuclear agenda. So I'm absolutely delighted that Adam's going to get us started for this first session, describing those challenges in relation to NATO and Europe. Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. This feels like a real honour. I do not know PONI well, but having just made its acquaintance, it strikes me as absolutely the right institution at the right time, and it is clearly going from strength to strength. Christina has given me my marching orders. I am to say something brief about NATO and nuclear in a changing security landscape, including the role of the UK deterrent in NATO, given Brexit. So I'll do that, but I hope you won't mind if I range more widely too. As I do so, please just remind you that I now speak in an entirely personal capacity and as director of the ELN, and not as a representative of HMG. What a liberating feeling that is. A little bit of context. As usual, we feel ourselves to be at an inflection point. We always feel ourselves to be at an inflection point in international affairs, and this applies as much to nuclear as to other security matters. First, things are headed in directions that are giving nuclear issues more profile. The majority of states have got fed up waiting for the P5 and are negotiating a nuclear ban treaty. North Korea and Putin, in their different ways, are rattling nuclear sabers more than in recent years, and a new US president wants to have his country remain top of the pack. So higher profile And secondly, greater fluidity. The Iran nuclear deal still seems to me in the balance. The early stages of modernization are being worked on for at least the UK, US, and French nuclear deterrents. So things are being decided now that will influence for many years to come. New technologies are disrupting old equations, and there's an uncertain and an unsafe outlook in the NATO-Russia deterrence relationship. So what direction will NATO and the rest of the world take? Answers, I feel, in the next 12 or 18 months could determine the next few decades. So first, a few observations about where we are, then some thoughts about where we might go. So where has NATO got to? My personal view. NATO, of course, is not immune from the greater prominence being given internationally to nuclear capability. There is no area of NATO life that has not been affected by the annexation of Crimea, and that includes nuclear policy. But the alliance has moved very cautiously on nuclear since 2014. It's true that modernization was already under consideration and has been continued, and the prospect of any serious consideration of B-61 withdrawal from Europe has receded. The alliance remains an explicitly nuclear one. On the other hand, NATO has not yet, so far as I know, I'm now 6 months out of date, taken some of the steps that might seem to be in the logic of a renewed deterrence relationship with Russia. So no resumed linkage between conventional and nuclear to create a more explicit escalation chain. No consequent exercising of nuclear with conventional. And none of the conscious signaling of nuclear determination in the many ways that Moscow is so good at and so stupid about. There's been no desire at NATO, still less any attempt, to rewrite the hard-fought 2012 Deterrence and Defence Posture Review. It's illuminating, I think, that there has, if anything, been more focus in the alliance in the last 2 years or so on cyber than on nuclear. Rightly or wrongly, hybrid is the preoccupation. Unlike the last Cold War, NATO at least technically has conventional superiority and doesn't need to dwell as heavily as Russia on the nuclear dimension. And after a 25-year holiday from hard security, most allies have no appetite for doing so. So, my experience at NATO was that the UK is currently respected more for its diplomacy, that's self-serving, but I believe it, and its conventional military power rather than for its nuclear status. So, Christina, that's part of the answer to your exam question. And for all the uncertainties around President Trump's commitment to the alliance, the recent talk of a European nuclear deterrent, and all the upheavals of Brexit, my sense is that this is unlikely to change. In other words, yes, the UK is recognized as one of the alliance's 3 nuclear powers, but that isn't going to be a prominent feature of the UK position and positioning in NATO. It's true that NATO's Warsaw Summit communiqué had new language about UK and French nuclear deterrence as separate centres of decision-making, but this was not new doctrine. And although Brexit may tempt the British government to place greater political weight on its NATO roles, I don't see any easy UK wins from dwelling particularly on the nuclear dimension. So that's where I think we are. Where do we go from here, UK and NATO? If I'm right that our choices in the next year or two, so say between now and the 28th UN high-level conference on nuclear disarmament, which may or may not be in about September next year, if I'm right that this period may determine much about nuclear weapons policy for the next few decades, then I feel bound to ask not just what I think the prospects are, but what my children may think about our choices. Nuclear is a very long-haul proposition. The probability of getting rid of nuclear weapons in our lifetimes seems vanishingly small, and the probability of a nuclear device being used in anger somewhere in the world at some point in the next 70 years, having successfully survived the last 70, so roughly my children's lifetime, seems to me high. I think our nuclear clock should be at 1.5 minutes to midnight and not at 2.5. So what would my children wish NATO or I myself had done in my professional career to lower that probability of nuclear weapons use? I think perhaps 4 things, and I just want quickly to run through those. The first is about mitigating the risk. The easiest path, although it's not an easy one, for NATO and for the USA as it refreshes the triad, and for France as it modernizes, and for the UK as it pursues Trident's successor, is going to be to slip into a rather 20th century style of deepening nuclear action and reaction with Russia. And if that is going to be the case, my children would want me at least to have made the modern NATO-Russia deterrence relationship as safe as possible, to have mitigated the known risks. Here, there is a great deal still to be desired. For example, caring about nuclear postures as per your first and third sessions today, clear nuclear signaling, accurate reading of the other, coherence and stability in military plans, and a disciplined NATO-Russia dialogue. I repeat, in my view, the NATO-Russia deterrence relationship is not safe. It is less safe than in, for example, the second half of the 20th century's Cold War. Something needs to be done about that, and that's a large agenda. But knowing my kids, I don't think they would be satisfied for me to stop there. They would feel that it was not enough to have mitigated known risks. I should have tried to reduce the nuclear risk more absolutely. And at the moment, things are headed in the wrong direction. The INF treaty is fraying. Russia has suspended last year its participation in the plutonium disposal agreement. Trump has declared New START to be a bad deal. The Iran nuclear deal may be the last gasp of classic nuclear diplomacy. Not so much the future for the 21st century, but a holdover from the 20th. There are things that NATO could do here. It won't be particularly unilateral, I suspect, because although humans can be altruistic, states rarely are. It's not the job of NATO allies to give something for nothing. So stepping back from nuclear risks is far more likely to be a multilateral process than a unilateral one. And that's, of course, a pity, because multilateral is rather more difficult to achieve, but it does mean that nuclear dialogue has to be encouraged. And as far as NATO is concerned, It just isn't sensible for there to be no nuclear dialogue with Russia. Dialogue would not be a return to business as usual, but rather a start to business that needs to be done. I think there's a space here for a much stronger voice from European allies, above all on INF, which affects Europe so directly, but also on the impact of new technologies, such as the possible vulnerabilities of nuclear capabilities to cyber attack or cyber manipulation. And it's not hard to see a really clear role here for London or Paris or both, if they chose to take it. But NATO isn't talking about this right now, nor, so far as I know, is London. A second thing, well, actually third, after mitigating risk and trying to reduce it by tackling some of the basic classic arms control, is to look at new technologies. Both people and states find it easier to give up birds in the bush than birds in the hand. So addressing nuclear modernization and disruptive new technologies ought to be easier than reducing capabilities and technologies in which states and their military-industrial complexes are already heavily invested. The absence of arms control around ballistic missile defense or prompt global strike or drones or many other emerging technologies strikes me as shockingly casual. So I'm really glad that UK PONI is discussing today technologies. And incidentally, in passing, hats off to President Steinmeier for at least trying on conventional arms control. And may I encourage you, the policy community, to get more mobilized on multilateral new technology arms control, including nuclear. NATO, again, may be doing the basics of a deterrence relationship with its potential adversaries, but there's no sense at the moment of innovation, imagination, or forward thinking. Which brings me to my fourth and final, if modest, point that I think my kids would make to me, and that's about policy culture. The mindsets we swim in, if I can mix metaphors, make it unlikely that merely being careful about our own and others' nuclear postures or pursuing constructive dialogue about existing risks or negotiating down future risks is going to achieve much more than inadequate muddling forward. So, as they sit dying with their children on the beach in a radioactive wasteland, my children would wish that I and my kind at NATO had taken the risks a bit more seriously, accepting always, as the reasonable people that they are, that we were hampered by having to treat as a mere probability what for them had suddenly become an actual fact. To change an international strategic culture on something as emotional and as close to national sovereignty as nuclear is, and that's true for the nuclear have-nots as much as for the nuclear haves, would take some awfully big shifts. And I do wonder whether step by step will ever be enough, even though the international culture would change with each passing step. Chernobyl wasn't enough to affect nuclear weapons planning. Even the Cuban Missile Crisis, although it fed US-Soviet arms control, did not stop an extremely dangerous arms race. And right now, the bandwidth in most NATO governments for serious attention to nuclear risks, or even nuclear management, is not growing. and in some capitals it is actually shrinking. Maybe a horrific outcome on the Korean peninsula, he said brightly, or an accident between India and Pakistan would completely change the political weather. But I don't think my children would really countenance disaster, even in someone else's backyard, as a very satisfactory way forward. So I'm particularly interested in your second session on communicating nuclear. Communicating nuclear is obviously difficult, and yet it seems to me a high and rising priority. So, how fantastic that you are here today. What's happening on social media? When did a nuclear meme last go viral? If we want more risk management, more attention to disruptive change, more respect for the adversary, we need to foster a popular and strategic, so both in the public and in governments, international culture that is as serious about nuclear risks as, for example, as about climate change. I hope you will do that. A closing suggestion. When I was a child in Washington, D.C., after the Cuban Missile Crisis, my school class had to practice diving under our flimsy, wooden-topped, metal-framed desks, considerably less solid than those you were sitting around, to shelter ourselves from imagined nuclear blasts. Even at the age of 7, this seemed to me a plan unlikely to be very successful. But at least the memory has stayed with me. Thank you.
Adam, thank you very much for that, I think, powerful and thought-provoking, but also measured start to our day. We now have around 20 minutes or so for questions and answers, so if you will raise your hand if you wish to ask a question, and say when you ask your question who you're
So I thought the keynote speech was a great way to kick off the day, and we're going to pick up right where that left off. So Sir Adam Thomson, he started off by pointing out that we are at an inflection point with new technologies, some new and emerging threats, and geostrategic shifts. And so this panel is going to continue that conversation and talk about some of those specific issues. And I'm delighted to have our three speakers here. We're going to, they're each going to speak for about 10 minutes each. I'm not going to read through all their bios because you have them, and we are trying to leave as much time as possible for discussion at the end. And so to get us started right away is Alex Velez-Green, who is a research associate at CNAS, and we'll be talking about the collapsing battle space, the impact of emerging military technologies on the NATO-Russian nuclear relationship. Alex, do you want to kick us off?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, good morning. As Dr. Williams mentioned, my name is Alex Velez-Green, and I would say first, thank you so much for having me here today with you. So to start, the military technological environment is always changing, but today, as we've sort of touched upon already, it's changing faster and in more ways than it has before. A series of novel military technologies are set to enter the field by 2040. They include cyber, counterspace, and autonomous weapons. They also include hypersonic missiles, as well as electromagnetic railguns and directed energy weapons. And these may sound like science fiction, but they're either real or likely to become real in the coming decades. And the arrival of these technologies threatens to destabilize the NATO-Russian nuclear relationship. In this brief, I'll provide an overview of the technological trends in question, then I'll dive into their implications for NATO-Russian nuclear stability, and I'll wrap up with recommendations for NATO policymakers seeking to mitigate their destabilizing effects. The first two emerging technologies of concern are cyber and counterspace weapons. Both NATO and Russia see the decisive role that cyber weapons will play in future conflicts. Russia demonstrated this early on when it used cyber attacks to disrupt the Georgian military's response to its invasion in 2008, and NATO is investing heavily in its own cyber warfare capabilities. The outer space domain is likewise being militarized at a growing rate. Both the United States and Russia are building what we would call counterspace arsenals. These arsenals include anti-satellite missiles. Russia has also deployed what we'd call kamikaze satellites that can be used to ram enemy targets. And both sides have non-kinetic options, such as jammers and lasers. The United States and Russia are also developing hypersonic missiles, electromagnetic railguns, and directed energy weapons. And other NATO members are working on some of these technologies as well. Hypersonic missiles are designed to allow their users to kinetically strike any target on Earth far more rapidly than ever before. And these weapons are still in development, but they may take the form of boost glide systems, which are gliders that are rocket launched to the edge of Earth's atmosphere before gliding back into ground targets at speeds above Mach 5. Or they might take the form of scramjet-powered hypersonic cruise missiles. Electromagnetic railguns and directed energy weapons are also still in development. Railguns would use magnetic fields to hurl shells at speeds up to Mach 6, and directed energy weapons would use concentrated electromagnetic energy to disable or destroy enemy targets. And many researchers think that these systems may enter the field in the next few decades, and if and when they do, if and when they are fielded, they could be used as either highly cost-effective standoff weapons or even to augment ballistic missile defenses. Finally, NATO and Russia are both investing heavily in a range of autonomous military systems. On one end of this spectrum, these systems include highly automated data processors, which allow human operators to take command of and operationalize far larger quantities of data than they ever could before. On the other end, they include uninhabited strike assets, which many of us are more familiar with, operating on land, in the air, and at sea, as well as in cyberspace and outer space. It's important, particularly at this conference, to note now that neither the United States nor Russia have ruled out using unmanned systems, particularly unmanned bombers, for the nuclear mission. So why should the advent of these technologies matter to NATO? I would argue that there are two primary reasons. First, the near simultaneous introduction of these technologies will increase the risk of inadvertent escalation between NATO and Russia. And it will do this by collapsing the battle space and making it more difficult for states to set effective red lines. These technologies may also lower the nuclear threshold by tipping the conventional military balance or directly threatening states' nuclear deterrence. To the first point, cyber, non-kinetic counterspace, and hypersonic missiles in particular will allow states to attack one another with very little warning. The same weapons will also allow actors to strike farther with their initial strikes. For instance, Russia could use cyber or counterspace attacks from the very outset of a conflict to disrupt U.S. military transport in North Carolina or degrade communications across Europe. And this ability to strike farther faster will effectively collapse the battle space, bringing a far larger number of targets into immediate danger. This dynamic, in turn, could create a heightened sense of vulnerability, which may impel policymakers on both sides, both in Moscow as well as in NATO capitals, to act more rapidly or hastily, as some might characterize it, in crisis. And this will leave less time for them to determine whether a perceived threat is real and to design and enact a proportionate response. And this would set the stage for a higher risk of inadvertent escalation. That risk is compounded by the fact that these technologies would only thicken the fog of war. In other words, these capabilities are so new, and there has as yet been so little dialogue about them, that it will be difficult for states to set clear and credible red lines for the use, particularly early on, particularly shortly after they've been fielded. A lack of clearly defined red lines would, again, substantially increase the risk of inadvertent escalation. For instance, the United States might use hypersonic missiles to destroy targets in Kaliningrad in the context of future limited regional conflict, perhaps due to a contingency in the Baltics. But it might do so without realizing that Moscow would likely see the very use of these weapons as an indication that NATO were preparing for a larger decapitation strike or strategic disarming strike. At the same time, these technologies may lower the nuclear threshold in at least two distinct ways. First, they are likely to exacerbate the NATO-Russian conventional military imbalance. If NATO is first to deploy systems like electromagnetic railguns, directed energy weapons, and robotic swarms, it might be able to use these systems not only to dismantle Russia's defenses in the event of conflict, but to seriously erode Russia's ability to fight back with non-nuclear weapons. And this is something that Russian strategists are deeply concerned by today, and it is just this type of conventional mismatch that is a recipe for greater reliance on nuclear weapons by the weaker party. This was the basis for NATO's flexible response doctrine earlier on in the Cold War, and it's also a reason why many Russian strategists are arguing today for Moscow to adopt a doctrine of strategic preemption. In addition, emerging technologies may pose direct threats to states' nuclear deterrence. They could do so by targeting states' nuclear command and control systems, or NC2. For instance, again, as was alluded to earlier, U.S. policymakers are concerned that Russia may one day be able to use cyber weapons to temporarily disable our NC2, leaving us vulnerable to a first strike. Counterspace jammers or lasers could be used similarly to blind enemy NC2 satellites with little warning. Novel technologies may also allow states to target opponents' nuclear delivery vehicles in new ways. As Paul Bracken has written very compellingly, highly automated data processors might allow states to more effectively track and target mobile missiles. There's also the possibility that uninhabited undersea vehicles may one day be able to track and target enemy nuclear submarines. Finally, electromagnetic railguns and directed energy weapons might one day significantly enhance ballistic missile defenses. And this would seriously exacerbate Russian fears that NATO is pushing for a strategic first strike advantage. To put this in context, Russian strategists today fear that the United States will use hypersonic missiles to destroy most of their strategic forces while they're still on the ground or in port, and then follow up with these advanced ballistic missile defenses to mop up any missiles that are able to get through that initial Western barrage. Now, importantly, we must note that none of these threats need to be real for them to be destabilizing. It's enough for a state to think that one or more of these technologies could threaten its nuclear deterrent for it to have a destabilizing effect. In this case, that effect would be best understood as increased use or lose pressures. To put that another way, if Russia or the United States, United Kingdom, or France don't use their nuclear weapons early on in a crisis or conflict, they may find themselves disarmed by an enemy first strike. NATO must maintain a strong deterrent against Russia, but it must do so in ways that mitigate these destabilizing trends. To that end, I would submit that NATO should focus first on mitigating new ambiguity in the strategic environment. This would include dialogue with Russia to establish rules of the road for cyber and counterspace operations in particular. All parties, in NATO and Russia, should likewise take steps to promote the responsible use of military autonomy. This means, in particular, working to identify and limit destabilizing uses of this technology, such as the use of unmanned assets, unmanned strike assets, for the nuclear mission. And policymakers must also give special attention to emerging threats to the US, UK, French, and Russian nuclear deterrence. This means sustaining engagement, in particular with Russia, on NATO ballistic missile defenses, as well as taking steps to limit the size of America's and Russia's future hypersonic weapons stockpiles. And finally, NATO should prioritize improved resilience in force structure, posture, and doctrine. Increased resilience would give NATO policymakers more time to evaluate the veracity of a threat and design a tailored response in the event of crisis or conflict. And it may also help to dissuade Moscow from an attempt at strategic preemption by decreasing the likelihood of a successful disarming first strike. With that, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. That was a running start, I feel like, for this panel. And so next we have Andrea Howard, who is an MA candidate at the University of Oxford and with the U.S. Navy, and will be speaking on "Though she be but little, she is fierce?" Fierce. Question mark. Non-strategic nuclear weapons in crisis management. Andrea, we're so happy to have you here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There we go. Well, good morning. I attended my first RUSI event 2 years ago when I arrived in the UK for my graduate education. And I just remember thinking that it'd be incredible if I was important enough someday to have the opportunity to speak here. I'm certainly not important enough yet, but nonetheless, I'm really grateful and humbled to be here and to be in this tremendous venue with some really high caliber peers. So Alex, like we said, he sped it up really quickly, and I'm going to kick it old school and have us take a look backwards, and I think that will help inform the look forwards that we're trying to achieve in this conference. So this project follows two bits of logic that I acquired over the years. The first piece of reasoning helps answer the question posed here. How can a major power make credible an attempt to defend a smaller ally from attack by another major power? My ethics coursework in college and the submarine corps I'm about to enter promote the logic that if you want peace or deterrence, prepare for war. But another piece of logic that I picked up in grade school contributes. And that's that big things come in small packages like me. So the same can be said for non-strategic nuclear weapons, and history shows that these weapons platforms can perform two roles. The first is upholding an extended deterrence relationship between a defender and a pawn to then reduce the aggression of an attacker against the third-party pawn, depicted by our mouse here. This can work even when the aggressor has local conventional superiority, as with our elephant. Although there is no universally accepted definition of non-strategic nuclear weapons, this project focuses on the intended battlefield use of these weapons, wherein the yields and ranges could deny an aggressor the ability to achieve objectives on the tactical level. Especially under President Eisenhower, strategic weapons, on the other hand, came to be seen as unusable because of their massive yields and the escalation risk they posed. This project notes, though, that non-strategic weapons proved more useful because threats of their use have historically reduced the aggression of an attacker on a third party, without the seemingly inevitable escalation risk of threats to use strategic weapons on cities or industrial centers. So use the logic of Mill's comparative method of difference to explore 4 different cases involving non-strategic nuclear weapons. This method demands, though, that all of the main characteristics of the cases are nearly identical, save the potential differentiating factor, in this case, the issuing of threats of non-strategic nuclear weapons use. So I looked for uniformity, and there were sort of 4 criteria that popped up. An extended deterrence relationship, the presence of non-strategic nuclear weapons ready for firing, the involvement of the United States, and that the crisis took place between the first successful Soviet nuclear test, which broke the American monopoly, and also before 1962, after which the Cuban Missile Crisis arguably scared the superpowers into a type of nuclear détente. Less threats were issued. So the cases are listed here. We have the Korean crisis, the first and second Taiwan Strait crises, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of note, each case was actually a crisis in which the actors involved acknowledged that a threat of escalation existed and that the threat required urgent, immediate attention. The first three cases will serve as positive cases, so an explicit threat of tactical nuclear weapons use was issued. The Cuban Missile Crisis, though, is a negative case, as the Soviets did not issue an explicit threat of tactical nuclear weapons use as the defender. So just to keep me honest, I've listed some of the warheads and delivery platforms that could have been employed by the defender in each of these crises. So the capability portion of these threats was credible. As a spoiler alert on the resolve side, for each of the positive cases in which an explicit tactical nuclear threat was delivered, the attacker exhibited signs of significant, immediate, lessened aggression within 50 days of the threat's delivery. I define this as an expressed willingness to negotiate the end of the crisis, the signing of an agreement to terminate the crisis, the suspension of a specific military activity, or an increased emphasis on defensive measures. What I then tried to do, though, was to use a discourse analysis to determine how the threats of tactical nuclear weapons use by the defender translated into lessened aggression by the attacker. So the explicit statements in the study were categorized into light or heavy threats based on 4 criteria: the probability of retaliation, the level of escalation associated with the potential retaliation, the interpretation of the crisis severity, and the attempt to conventionalize tactical nuclear weapons. So due to time constraints, I want to just briefly show how this discourse analysis worked before addressing some of the background of the crises and the outcomes. So the 2 statements that were issued for the Korean crisis were both what I called light statements. Eisenhower's statement was extremely light in that it only mentioned a low probability consideration of use. And in the message conveyed by Dulles, there was still less than 100% certainty of retaliation, as well as a flexible level of stronger retaliation. The retaliation wasn't defined clearly. Nonetheless, the crisis soon thereafter ended with agreements on prisoner of war repatriation and the armistice in July. For the first Taiwan Strait crisis, the first statement was light, and the second 2 listed here were what I called heavy. So the vice president's statement, for instance, increases the probability of retaliation to near certainty with the phrase "will be used." And the admiral's use of destroy indicates a firm, higher level of escalation against China. After all the threats were issued in a short window of time, the Chinese communists then reopened negotiations and suspended shelling of the offshore islands. And now that you have a sense for how this discourse analysis works, I won't explicitly dissect these 2 heavy statements for the second Taiwan Strait crisis, but their delivery correlated with a reopening of peace talks and a more permanent establishment of a ceasefire plan. So note, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the only case in which the defender had to capitulate in some of its objectives. It was the negative case. The Soviet Union had to make a humiliating withdrawal of the missiles in Cuba, and Khrushchev's political career paid the price. Note, too, that the U.S. discovered the presence of tactical lunar rockets near the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and only at that point the U.S. attacker fully discounted the invasion option of response. Engaging a little bit in the counterfactual realm, had the Soviet Union disclosed the presence of the FKR cruise missiles, a secret that was kept for 50 years, and issued an explicit threat of TNW use earlier in the crisis, perhaps the U.S. would have not considered the invasion option or operated at the brinkmanship level, and the Soviets might not have needed to capitulate with a full withdrawal of missiles. But because of the methods used, the study just can't prove causation, but it does note some really interesting correlations. First, the use of threats correlated with the defender achieving its objectives. In the Korean crisis and 2 Taiwan Strait crises, the U.S. hoped for a return to the status quo.